Hi, everybody!
Jim Ryan will be officially retired as of the spring. He had been with Sony for 30 years. He was named the CEO of Sony Interactive Entertainment in 2019 and oversaw the launch of the PlayStation 5. The launch was a successful one as the console has moved over 40 million units at the time of recording. It's also the 16th best-selling console of all time, which is impressive when you consider the struggles of the 9th generation of gaming hardware and what it has had to contend with. However, it's probably for the best that Jim Ryan is stepping down as Sony's CEO, despite the brand being arguably close to the most lucrative it's ever been. I've covered this in previous videos, mostly in my video on why Sony needs to diversify its current gaming library. A card for that should be popping up on screen now. Anyways, PlayStation hasn't been nearly as diverse as it has been in previous generations of hardware. Just look at the PS1, it had a mix of horror games, platformers, fighting games, racing games, and a bunch of others. The PS2 was pretty diverse as well. The PS3 was where we started to see a new Sony with more of a focus on shooters and cinematic action games. The PlayStation 4 saw Sony doubling down on the cinematic action-adventure titles. That has continued into the PS5 era. Admittedly, that type of game is really only found on PlayStation and to a lesser extent on computer. There's nothing wrong with this type of game, and they are incredibly enjoyable. However, PlayStation-branded studios have focused on the genre far too heavily. This has caused burnout amongst the PlayStation install base, as there just isn't enough variety in first-party games. Under Jim Ryan's tenure, there has been a shift towards games as a service model, which we're just starting to see some upcoming exclusives for the console. Now, I have no issue with live service games. One could argue one of my favorite genres of video game is tailor-made for this business model, that being fighting games. You have the yearly season pass for DLC fighters, costumes, and additional stages in some instances, but that's on top of being a full-price game for the most part, which, let's be honest, is kind of shitty for the consumer. There have been some free-to-play fighters that are close to a live service game. In all honesty, if a game is going to be sold as a service, then it should be free-to-play, as that's far friendlier a proposition for the consumer. However, this shift to a games as a service model under Jim Ryan is arguably not a good thing for PlayStation. So for basically the past decade, Sony has been all in on cinematic games at the expense of diversity. The move to games as a service model has been rather sudden. There wasn't really much of a transition period. It's a hard pivot. Now Sony's PR department have been spinning it like PlayStation will still offer the cinematic experiences they've become known for. This is likely the truth, as Sony won't want to alienate the core audience they've cultivated in recent years. However, 2024 is going to be the first year where the PlayStation exclusives on offer are going to be primarily live service titles. A lack of a transition period is going to prove tough for Sony as a whole. Why am I saying that, though? The reason I feel this transition for Sony is going to be difficult comes down to the simple fact Spider-Man 2 is more or less the last big cinematic experience in the cards before the transition, and Sony haven't exactly been releasing live service titles to ease said transition. Like I said before, this is a hard pivot. In all honesty, 2023 should have been a transition year. I know with how modern game development is, that's easier said than done, as projects now take far longer and are more expensive. However, look at how PlayStation weaned us off the PS4 in the transition to PS5. The major exclusives for Sony have more or less all been on PS4 at the same time as PS5. This makes sense when you consider the PS4 has such a large install base with just over 117 million units sold since 2013. You also have to consider there was a microchip shortage for the PS5 for the majority of its early life thanks to the pandemic. Basically, Sony would have been shooting themselves in the foot by not continuing the support of the older hardware. This did mean the PS5's fairly robust library looks a whole lot worse when you consider big hitting titles like God of War Ragnarok, Gran Turismo 7, Horizon Forbidden West, and Spider-Man Miles Morales were all cross-generation titles. If Sony hadn't supported the previous generation of hardware, the PS5 library would have a ton of people salivating over the idea of acquiring the console. But considering the majority of the actual PS5 exclusives have either been timed ones or flops with very few killer IPs, it makes the console look weaker. Of the exclusives, it has mostly been confined to titles like Returnal, Demon's Souls Remake, and of course Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart. So I do support the fact Sony lengthened the lifespan of the PS4, but I do think they overdid it. Basically, Sony's 8th generation console has had a very long sunset period, which was originally slated to end in 2021. But you see the problem here. Sony keeping the PS4 on life support for so long, not having too many killer apps exclusive to the PS5, and general fatigue by consumers for open world and semi-open world affairs put the PS5 in kind of rough shape. The fact these live service titles will be such a heavy focus going forward really hurts the brand more. Now I know I'm in the minority of the general gaming audience. I like very niche games for the most part, so live service games don't do much for me. But if you look at the demographics these games target, they're typically kids, teenagers, and early 20-somethings, which is typically the age demographic most gaming companies cater towards, as they are typically the ones spending the most money in the gaming industry. But the distinct lack of a transition period is frustrating. For the most part, the PS5's install base is going to skew a bit older at present because the older consumer prefers narrative-driven action games. It's when you look at it from that lens you start to realize Sony really needs an IP to bridge the gap, and they do have a few games that could work perfectly for that. Of the in-house Sony marquees, the best studios to helm the bridge project would either be Insomniac Games or Guerrilla Games. Both have worked on first-person shooters in the past, and that could function both as a cinematic experience and as a live service title. Those games are of course Killzone and Resistance. Killzone last got a sequel in 2013 with Shadowfall, which did well critically but was kind of a wet fart in terms of sales figures. The last reported sales I was able to find come from March 2nd of 2014. By that point, Shadowfall had sold around 2.1 million copies, which is still a decent amount, but it's not exactly setting the world on fire. According to VG charts, Resistance 3 sold just 1.5 million copies for its lifetime, which was well below the 2.47 million units sold for Resistance 2. Now you have to take VG charts with a grain of salt, but it's worth noting neither sold particularly well. Killzone has never been a franchise that sold gangbusters. It has always been a relatively niche title within the first-person shooter genre, which makes sense as that style of game was oversaturated when those titles released. Resistance sold decently for the most part. The first title sold around 2.1 million copies, which is huge when you consider it was a launch window title on a console that sold relatively poorly until its third year or so. It just shouldn't have been marketed as a Halo killer, as that's really what doomed the franchise. So why am I babbling about these long-dead FPS franchises? Well, when you think about it, either one of these is a good stopgap game to transition PlayStation into a new era. Previous rumblings have indicated Sony plans to revive some legacy IPs during the PS5's tenure. That's a great thing. However, I can't think of too many titles that would be ideal for being a stopgap to get their existing audience to buy into games as a service model. Just 3 in fact. Resistance, Killzone, and Twisted Metal. There's clearly a demand for a Twisted Metal game, as the TV series made for Peacock has done relatively well. Just like there's a demand for Resistance and Killzone, as Sony now lack a dedicated first-person shooter exclusive IP in their current lineup. Also, if you look at the PS5 exclusive Destruction All-Stars, which was popular for a short while then died off quickly, car combat games are a genre that is severely underutilized at present. In all honesty, Destruction All-Stars was a mediocre experience, feeling more like a proof of concept for a far larger project. Destruction All-Stars was developed by Lucid Games Limited. There are also noted fans of the Twisted Metal series. When you look at Destruction All-Stars, you can see the Twisted Metal DNA in there if you squint hard enough. That's why I said it feels like a proof of concept title more than an actual game. If the game had weapons and not just hero car abilities, it'd be Twisted Metal in all but name. So Sony clearly have 3 really strong IPs from which they could develop a stopgap solution. Clearly though, it would take time to develop any of these games into said stopgap. So 2024 is out, and we have no idea what 2025 is going to look like. Some of these live service games slated for next year could get pushed back into 2025. It's not likely Guerrilla are working on a Killzone title at present. It was announced in July of this year the Amsterdam-based studio are working on a staggering 16 projects. Some will be Horizon-related, and I very much doubt one of the 16 games will turn into a Killzone title. If anything, I'd argue if we ever see another Killzone game, it'll be handled by a small developer. We do know they have one multiplayer title in the works, which rumors indicate it's going to be set in the Horizon universe and focus on different characters. I imagine this is going to be one of the many games as a service title Sony Studios are currently cooking up, so the likelihood of the multiplayer project having anything that could act as a stopgap between the cinematic games we've grown accustomed to and a live service title is exceptionally low. However, it does seem Insomniac is working on something multiplayer related. I've covered in a previous video what I think that project is. A card will be up on screen now for that video. I actually do have hopes this title will be more than just a game as a service title, given Insomniac have shown they're capable of delivering a game that's both cinematic and has a compelling multiplayer component. So I know I've buried the lead a little bit with this video. However, I felt the need to contextualize why Jim Ryan leaving Sony is a good thing. Under his stewardship, Sony has really changed. The gaming industry has as well. Some will blame Jim Ryan for the whole fiasco that was The Last of Us Part 2, a game that has basically ruined Naughty Dog in the eyes of a ton of gamers. I know my confidence in that studio is gone. Personally, it's not the storyline for The Last of Us Part 2 that I hated, though I will admit I don't like that part either. It's the fact the game was fucking boring to play. Some will blame Jim Ryan for how the game turned out. However, The Last of Us Part 2 was announced during the PlayStation Experience from December 3rd of 2016. So who was PlayStation CEO during that time frame right up until his retirement in September of 2019? That would be Shawn Layden. So the majority of the work done for The Last of Us Part 2 was during his tenure. There have been rumors his retirement was the result of a power struggle between him and Jim Ryan. I can't confirm or deny that though. It's just noteworthy that most of the blame for The Last of Us Part 2 lies at the feet of Layden, not Ryan. Not that I'm the biggest fan of Jim Ryan either. In fact, I would say his tenure as CEO of Sony Interactive Entertainment was mediocre at best. He didn't do anything exceptionally well, nor did he totally fuck things up. However, it's clear his wishes to offer more live service games have some PlayStation fans feeling alienated. So I just mentioned the fact PlayStation fans are feeling alienated. What does this really mean for the future of the PlayStation brand? Until a permanent CEO is named, that's hard to say. It also means I can't really speculate on the future of the brand too much, as no one's entirely sure what direction the company will take. It's clear the cinematic style of game won't go anywhere, as that's PlayStation's hallmark, and that's not a bad thing. It's also going to be years before we really see the works of Jim Ryan as CEO, as the majority of the projects being developed right now have been greenlit during his tenure. Here's hoping some of that will at minimum be hits. The live service games will definitely be hits with a younger demographic, and that's a good thing, as the PlayStation brand needs to bring in new blood if it wants to remain at the top of the console heap. However, this could also lead the current core audience leaving the brand entirely, as they no longer feel catered to. It's clear to me whoever takes over is going to have to restructure the company at least a little bit, as the current state of it almost feels directionless. As I covered in a previous video, diversifying the game lineup is a must. Sony can't just coast off brand recognition here, nor can they entirely leave the live service model in the dust. At present, things are looking awkward. Bringing back some legacy IPs would definitely be a step in the right direction. Also, offering games beyond the cinematic over-the-shoulder adventure titles is a must. Keep your eyes peeled for a video I'm working on about the IPs Sony needs to bring back, as that's in the works. So those were my thoughts on why Jim Ryan's retirement is a good thing for the PlayStation brand. I feel like the company needs to bring in a younger CEO that can grow with the brand into the future. But what are your thoughts? Did you like the Jim Ryan tenure as the CEO of PlayStation? Let me know in the comments section, and don't forget to like and subscribe. 2 of my previous videos will be popping up now. One is a video YouTube thinks you'll enjoy, and the other is on the possibilities of what the Insomniac multiplayer project could be. Check them out, and until next time, keep blazing that trail.